This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you click on the link in the description below, it'll take you to their store and they'll know I sent you there. Hello everyone, I'm Nitahone, and it is Saturday, so that means it's time for another episode of the History of the Banned and Restricted list. Last time we looked at 2010, a fairly quiet year where only 2 cards were added to the Banned and Restricted list of any format. 2011 was quite different, and was one of the busier years for the Banned and Restricted list ever. This is partly because some cards proved themselves to be very broken in Standard, but it was also because the Modern format was created and it came into existence with the Banned and Restricted list. In this video, we're going to focus on the bannings and restrictions not related to Modern in 2011. Next Saturday, the entire focus of the video will be on Modern's first year as a format in 2011, which involved a lot of bannings. That means that in this video, we're going to talk about 2 cards that got banned in Standard and another that got banned in Legacy. These were all relatively new cards, and that is something we haven't seen for a while in this series, as the last couple videos have looked at cards that had been around for a while, but became busted as a result of new cards that were printed. That isn't the case here. These cards are just super powerful. Let's start by looking at the Standard cards to get the ban hammer in 2011. There were no announcements in 2011 until June of that year, when 2 cards from Worldwake were banned in Standard, Jace the Mind Sculptor and Stoneforge Mystic. This was the first time in 6 years that Wizards had to ban cards out of Standard. They hadn't had to do it since Mirrodin Block, and that is honestly a pretty impressive run, but boy did they screw up with Jace and Stoneforge Mystic. These 2 cards are 2 of the more notoriously busted cards ever printed, as evidenced by the fact that both of these cards would eventually be banned in some non-standard formats as well, and they both see a lot of play in the Eternal formats. Let's start with Jace. Jace was a Swiss Army knife of awesome, being the first Planeswalker to be ever given 4 different loyalty abilities. He had a +2 that could operate kind of as a prison effect by taking away the good cards your opponent might draw and leaving the ones you knew wouldn't help them on top of their library. His 0 loyalty ability was basically Brainstorm, a card so good that it got restricted in Vintage back in 2008. The kind of card selection and card advantage you get out of brainstorming every turn is particularly good, especially if you combine it with a shuffle effect like a Fetch Land or Squadron Hawk, because then you can shuffle away the cards you don't want on top of your library. So already, between a +2 and a 0 ability, Jace can have major impacts on card quality for both you and your opponent. Then, you throw in a -1 ability that can help protect Jace by bouncing creatures, and an ultimate that kills your opponent in 2 turns, and you have a powerhouse on your hands, all for only 4 mana. However, despite all this power, Jace was not banned out of Standard very quickly. He was actually printed in Worldwake back in 2010, and it took until 2011 for him to get banned. So, why did he eventually get banned? Well, because he, and Stoneforge Mystic, which we are going to talk about in a moment, were key cogs in a deck called Caw-Blade that is arguably the most dominant Standard deck of all time. This was a mid-range deck filled with sources of card advantage, and it was loaded up with all the best cards from that Standard format. Caw-Blade made Standard homogeneous and uninteresting, but Wizards was reluctant to ban Jace for a while, but eventually, after he'd managed to put up an absurd number of top 8s, it was clear he had to go for the health of the Standard format. Before 2011 was out, Jace was also placed on the new Modern format's ban list, and he was banned in the soon-to-be-defunct Extended format. He would eventually get unbanned in Modern in 2018, and now, Magic's most powerful Planeswalker is legal in Modern. Now, let's talk about Stoneforge Mystic, another incredibly powerful card that helped to power the absurd Caw-Blade deck. The Mystic might seem sort of unassuming. I mean, big deal, right? She's a 2-mana 1/2 that draws you an equipment. And I mean, even if she does let you put equipment into play at a discount, it still costs mana and she has to tap, and that equipment has to be equipped to something, so how great can that really be? Well, that might have been kind of true about the Mystic if it weren't for the living weapon mechanic, which was on equipment like Batterskull. The Mystic could search it up and put it into play on turn 3 with no problem, and it turns out a 4/4 with Vigilance and Lifelink on turn 3 is pretty scary, and can quickly allow you to run away with the game. What's more is, even if your opponent kills the creature, you still have the Batterskull which you can equip to something else. However, even in the absence of Living Weapon, there were enough powerful equipment in that Standard format that she would still have been amazing, things like Sword of Feast and Famine. It also didn't hurt that the Mystic also gave you another shuffle effect to use alongside Jace the Mind Sculptor's Brainstorm ability. So Stoneforge Mystic had to be banned to eliminate Cobblade in Standard, but this created kind of an awkward situation, because Wizards had included 2 copies of the card in one of the new Phyrexia event decks called War of Attrition. Because these decks were supposed to be tournament ready, and Wizards still wanted that product to be able to be bought and played at a tournament right away, Stoneforge Mystic's banning came with an unusual caveat. If you were playing the exact War of Attrition event deck, you could play Stoneforge Mystic in Standard. But if even one card were different, Stoneforge Mystic could not be played in your deck. Luckily, the deck didn't also include something like Batterskull, or people really might have been sleeving up the event deck. Like Jace, the Mystic would be banned in both Modern and Extended before the year was out. Also like Jace, Stoneforge Mystic has gone on to an impressive career in Eternal formats where it really thrives. And she was also recently unbanned in Modern, where she has already started to see play in decks built around the Thopter Sword combo that we talked about in last week's video. The only other ban and restricted announcement in 2011 that didn't involve Modern or the soon-to-be phased-out Extended format came in September, and it was another one that had to ban a new card. In this case, it was new Phyrexia's Mental Misstep, which was banned in Legacy. Mental Misstep might seem like a really narrow counterspell, and that's kind of what it is, but it turns out it isn't all that narrow in a format like Legacy, where tons of 1-mana spells are played. But what really pushes this into being too good is Phyrexian mana. This is the first time we've encountered it in this series, but it won't be the last, because it is one of the most broken mechanics ever. Phyrexian mana was a mechanic introduced in New Phyrexia that allowed people to either pay colored mana, in the case of Mental Misstep it could be a blue mana, or you could pay 2 life for each Phyrexian mana symbol in the casting cost. What does that mean for Mental Misstep? Well, first it means that Legacy players had access to yet another free counterspell in a format that has a ton of them. But unlike the other ones, which ask you to do something with islands or blue cards, Mental Misstep doesn't, and that means you could play it in any deck in Legacy, since you don't have to actually do anything with blue mana or blue cards. This resulted in a horrible play experience, especially because Mental Missteps could counter Mental Missteps, and it wasn't unusual to see a bunch of these on the stack at the same time. So many decks were running the Misstep that it made things really uninteresting, as often occurs when really powerful colorless cards are printed. Mental Misstep was also banned in Extended and in Modern in 2011, and in August of 2019 it was also restricted in Vintage. Anytime a card is banned in Legacy and restricted in Vintage, you know the card was a huge mistake. Well, that does it for this episode of the History of the Banned and Restricted list. 3 really new cards had to be banned in various formats that year, putting an end to a fairly good run of new cards not completely breaking Standard. There is a lot more to talk about in the year 2011 though, and next time we'll talk about the creation of the Modern format and talk about the cards that had to be banned in the format in its first year. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future episodes of this series, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to catch up on the other episodes, you should see the playlist on your screen now. Thanks for watching.